Do you know what time it is? It's Supernatural Storytime. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Halloween on our street. Sometimes when you're a kid, you dream shit that you don't tell your parents. And it's not because what you dreamt was so bad, but because you have no words to explain what the fuck it was you dreamt. And that I'd had the dream the night before Halloween. Add that on Halloween night, we'd be treated to the added excitement of a bustling movie shoot on our street. And not just any movie, but a scary one aptly named Halloween. But when the strange elements of my dream started playing out for real, albeit in different ways, I'd wonder why I hadn't tried doing something. The only person I shared my dream with was Ricky, who after Halloween would stop being my friend. As if all of this wasn't enough, add that Halloween 1978 marked the night that mute old Greg cracked. Like all weird dreams do, mine started normally. Ricky and me were riding our bikes on Meridian Street. And just so you know, Ricky was a girl. But she was different from the other girls in my 4th grade class. In fact, it wouldn't occur to me that she was a girl until we were in middle school. By then her family had moved to a prestigious neighborhood where the estates were old, where the houses weren't houses but mansions. And Ricky would become a cheerleader and continue pretending she didn't know me. In the dream, Ricky rode next to me in her much too cool 16-spoke decal-loaded spoiler-framed BMX bike. I remember how she turned and squinted her big lash brown eyes at me and said, "We should be dead siblings for Halloween." Dead what? I had no idea what a sibling was, but I remember thinking, I'll ask my mom. Right after saying that, Ricky dipped down onto one of the steepest streets I'd ever seen. So steep, the thought of joining her scared me. But I gathered all my wits and dipped the nose of my cheap Sears Stingray on the precipice and followed. The entire ride down felt like a free fall, like the tires of my bike were no longer touching the ground, and the sick feeling of all my organs lifting and crowding into my upper torso overcame me. At the bottom of the hill was Old Man Gregory, who wore no pants, but had a Star Trek shirt on. You know, the kind Mr. Spock and Captain Kirk wore. His wrinkled genitals didn't look nothing like my own boy part, so I sort of stared. If that wasn't weird enough, old Greg, as we called him, had a surgeon's mask over his mouth and nose. Miraculously, and as happens in dreams, we were no longer on our bikes, but walking and following him into his house. Once inside his house, I remember being extremely cold, as if we'd entered a freezer. Old Greg's living room was hazy with frosty air, and instead of the regular furniture you'd find in a living room, there was a makeshift operating room. There was a sheet-covered operating bed in the center of the room with shiny steel tables on either side. On the tables were scalpels, scissors, trays, and other grisly instruments that glinted in the little light. The table had leather restraint straps to keep patients held down. When I glanced toward old Greg, he had managed to grab Ricky from behind, with her arms prone at her sides, and was lifting her onto the table. Her legs, arms, and even her head stuck out stiffly, just like a mannequin's. I remember running over and screaming, but in the skewed way dreams can lapse time, Ricky was already tied down when I got to her. Except she wasn't struggling or trying to free herself. She was stiff and smiling up at the ceiling in an expectant way, as if she knew and accepted what would come next. The thing was, I had no idea what that thing was. "Son, you stay away from her," old Greg said, which didn't make sense because everyone knew he was a mute. He held a large butcher knife up to my face, and I stepped back. This pissed him off, and he came at me, jabbing it midair in my direction. "You want your sister fixed, don't you?" In the sudden way that a regular dream state can transform into a lucid dream, I realized I had the power to act, and so I backed away and sped out of old Greg's house, feeling like a coward for leaving my best friend behind. When I woke up, the excitement of it being Halloween helped deposit the dream into whatever recesses are reserved in a kid's brain for such nightmares. But the tone of the dream, the dreaded sense of it, would linger a long time. It was a school day, so right after my mom helped me get my zombie costume on, I raced out to meet up with Ricky. She was waiting in front of her own modest house, wearing a ripped-up, soiled dress and the same white face paint I had, except her mom had darkened the areas under her eyes, giving her a macabre look my face lacked. As we walked, I got straight to my dream, telling her every detail of it except the part where I left her behind with old Greg. It was then that it occurred to me to ask, "What's a sibling?" "Brother and sister," Ricky said without much interest. "By the way, I got us fake blood." "Why do we need fake blood?" "Because zombie boy and girl are murdered." Ricky said the word murdered in the most ghastly way she could, drawing it out the R's for effect. "There's no way we can put it on now. Remember, Mrs. Shackle said, no blood, no gore." Ricky rolled her eyes. "It's for when we trick or treat, duh." Like I said, the movie Halloween was being shot on our street, and for 2 days prior, all we noticed were a lot of white trucks and a few people. But by the time school let out on Halloween and Ricky and me walked home, the street had been closed to traffic. It was buzzing with hundreds of people running in and out of the Van der Velt's white Victorian, the house where all the bad stuff was supposed to happen. Since we didn't know what the movie was about, we approached a couple of crew members who were talking by a wardrobe truck. Since Ricky was bolder than me, I let her do the asking. "What's your movie about?" The lady and the man who'd been talking smiled down at us. The lady was pretty, with brownish hair and a smart-looking face that softened when she smiled and tousled my hair. "Oh gosh, I don't know if we should tell you. Your mom might not want you guys to know." She smiled and tousled my hair again, but the guy with her laughed. Ricky, though, was pissed. "We're not brother and sister." "So, what kind of monster is in your movie?" I cut in because that's really all I wanted to know. The guy chuckled and reached into the wardrobe truck and pulled out a plastic mask and said, "Well, if you think Captain Kirk is a monster, you'd be right." When he held up the mask, we could see that indeed he held a Captain Kirk mask. Confused and feeling a little cheated by the answer, we walked off, but Ricky suddenly stopped, grabbed my arm with her hand and said, "Oh my God." "What?" I said, yanking my arm away from her kung fu grip. "In your dream, didn't I say we should dress up as siblings? And didn't old Greg think we were brother and sister?" Ricky lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Yeah, so everybody thinks we're brother and sister. And old Greg, who was a dentist, was wearing a doctor's mask and a Star Trek shirt," Ricky added, looking genuinely scared. None of what she said made any sense to me, not yet anyway, which frustrated her. "Wait, that crazy old guy was a dentist? Oh my God, you didn't know?" Ricky's eyes got even bigger, and she looked genuinely frightened. "What? Being a dentist is bad?" "No. What's bad is his son killed his own sister. Old Greg tried to save her, but she bled to death." "No way." This was juicy stuff, and I wondered why I hadn't heard of it before. "Yeah, well, everybody knows about it. Kyle, it's why he stopped talking." All fear and wonder had left her face, and she was back to the task at hand, deciphering my weird dream. Anyway, just now that lady thought we were brother and sister, and the mask the guy had was a Captain Kirk mask. It's a lot like your dream. Ricky was right. None of it was exactly like my dream, but it was out of the ordinary that those things had matched up. Still, it wasn't enough. These things could easily fall into the realm of coincidence. Again, I hadn't told Ricky about ditching her in the dream either. There were a lot of things we wouldn't know until later. Later, we'd learn that Mike Myers' mask in the movie was actually a store-bought plastic Captain Kirk mask with eyes cut out and spray painted white. And what neither Ricky or me would know until we were old enough to see Halloween and no longer on speaking terms was that the lady we met, the lady who'd messed up my hair, was, Jamie Lee Curtis. That was the happy part of the day. Neither one of us had any idea that the real prophetic part of the evening was yet to come. In those days, parents let kids roam the streets freely on Halloween. Since we were in third grade, both our parents allowed us to trick or treat on our own after we promised to remain with a 4-block radius. Since Ricky had brought the blood, she got to put it on first. Using the ineffective brush it came with, she slathered it on her light gray dress while I stood waiting in the alley behind our houses. "Leave some for me," I said as I watched the small bottle emptying out more and more. By the time we finished with the bottle, there was enough to rub on my face and not much more. After I dumped the empty bottle into a nearby trash can, we set off to begin the candy hoarding ritual, carrying our hopeful collection sacks at our sides. Time has no meaning to 8-year-old kids, so looking back, it's hard to say when we ended up back at the movie shoot or whose idea it was. But before getting there, I remember going from house to house, being properly greeted by moms, dads, and even kids who filled our bags with all kinds of candy. It was dark that night, and what are called the Santa Ana winds had begun to blow. Ricky and me stood in a crowd of onlookers in front of the now ghoulishly lit Victorian, with a hot wind blowing leaves, loose hair, and casting eerie shadows over the windows of the house. The surreal effect of hot winds blowing at night added to the already surreal experience of watching a film shoot. When a crew member hollered, "Quiet on the set, we are shooting," followed by "Action," the street died. No one moved, coughed, or turned their heads. But the wind, oblivious to man's silly creations, grew stronger and howled, sending a chill up my back. It wasn't until I heard the harrowing series of screams coming from inside the house that I turned my head and noticed that Ricky was gone. No longer next to me, chewing at her caramel noisily, Ricky was gone. Weaving through the adults crowded on the street watching the filming, I kept my eyes focused for her gray dress and teased out blonde hair. But nothing. The actress inside the house set off another peal of screams, again sending a cold shiver up my back. When I got away from the crowd, I looked up heavily treed Meridian to see the dark forms of costumed kids. Some walked, some dashed under streetlights, interrupting the dancing shadows of leaves that shook in the hot breeze. As I passed these kids on my way north and away from the glare of the filming location, I caught snippets of their conversation. "Mom's not gonna let you eat that. Snickers are way better. Don't do that, it's mine." That last voice was familiar. It was Casey, Ricky's friend from gymnastics class. "Casey, stop." I aimed my voice in the direction of the Mary Poppins costume. "Who's that?" Casey asked. "Kyle. Have you seen Ricky? I can't find her." Casey. "Not since I saw her with you." She turned and ran off to join her group, who raced up the lawn of a nearby house. Here was when panic set in, riffling through my body and setting off the next course of events. With determination, I headed to old Greg's house, not knowing what I thought I'd do once there. What I did know was that since Ricky pointed out how similar my dream had been to some of the events of the day, it was the logical place to go. Old Greg lived 2 blocks away, so I ran towards it, ignoring all the dark shadows of kids in costume that I passed or bumped to on the way. When I got to his tall and unkempt yellow house, he was sitting on a lawn chair in his yard, a huge plastic jack-o'-lantern filled with candy at his side. Old Greg looked up at me without smiling. Our eyes met, and I took in the clouded cataract frankness of his glances. I stood my ground on the concrete path leading to his house when I remembered that old Greg didn't speak. "My friend Ricky, have you seen her?" What I really wanted to say was, "You have her, don't you?" But I didn't have the nerve to. The old man shook his head. "She's dressed like me, but in a dress with blood." His hard-focused look shook me. There was something wrong with this man. There was an intensity about him, like he was boiling inside and ready to burst. "Can I look?" He stood from his chair, stretched, and looked back at his front door, hunched his shoulders to indicate his lack of concern. So I walked toward the porch, climbed the steps, and stood at wide open door. That his living room wasn't made up to look like an operating room didn't faze me, but even so, it was the same room. The walls, the windows, the fireplace, and the mantel were all set in the same location as in the dream. It was then that I heard the wooden floor creak directly behind me, and I turned. Old Greg stood right behind me. He stood much too close, staring into my eyes as if he knew me. From the corner of my eye, I could see that both his hands were shaking at his sides and that he was getting ready to speak. "You can search high and low, but I ain't letting you hurt your sister." He looked around the room before turning and heading back outside. The guy was crazy and I needed to leave. By now it hit me that Ricky was out getting more candy than I'd ever get while I stood in crazy old Greg's house, immobilized by fear and frozen in place. There was a split moment before I could bolt the fuck out of his house, that looked toward his dimly lit den to see what looked like a Star Trek poster on the wall. But even to this day I can't be sure. As soon as I saw him sit back down in his lawn chair, I sprinted out of there, running past old Greg and the group of costume kids walking up the path. When I got home, and in the excitement of dumping all my candy onto the floor, I forgot to mention Ricky's disappearance to my mom. It wasn't until she walked in from the kitchen after taking a phone call that the old worry came back. "Kyle, that was Ricky's mom. She said Ricky hasn't come home yet. Do you think she might have gone somewhere else?" I shook my head, not knowing how to explain how she'd disappeared. "Kyle, did you see her go home?" My heart was pounding, and I knew I had to come clean. "We were watching the movie, and she was next to me the whole time until..." "Until what, Kyle?" My mom's face was stern now. "Until after the lady screamed and Ricky was gone." "Gone?" "I went looking for her. I asked Casey, and she didn't know either." After I was sent to bed, I heard my mom talking on the phone for the rest of the night. Over the course of my sleep, I'd waken when our phone rang, but sink right back to sleep soon after. Hours later, I woke up in a drenched sweat and headed for my mother's room. She was up and sitting on the edge of her bed when I opened the door. "Has she come home?" "No, honey, but the police are looking for her." My mom patted the bed next to her, so I joined her. "They should check old Greg's house," I spat out. "The old man? Why are you saying this, Kyle?" My mom faced me, and I didn't need to look up at her to know her face was serious and drawn. I didn't answer. I couldn't. What was there to say? I'd had a dream? That I'd gone over myself and checked his house? The thing was, even though I'd gone over and hadn't seen anything, I kept remembering what he'd said about not hurting my sister and the strange lifeless look in his eyes. "Honey, you need to tell me what you know. You won't get in trouble." My mother faced me on the bed and gripped my arms with both her hands. Her face was drawn and scared. "You need to tell us what you know. Did you see her go there, Kyle?" "Yes," I lied. "I had to." In a few minutes, I'd hear the deep male voices of policemen downstairs, and when my mom called me down, I knew I had to maintain my lie. All of it hit home when I saw the tall men in the dark blue uniforms standing in our living room, making the biggest room in our house look like a dollhouse miniature. "Son, it's important that we get an eyewitness. No judge will let us into Dr. Gregory's home without a warrant. To get that, we need a witness." That was when Ricky's mom and dad walked in, without knocking, and joined all the adults who waited for me to speak. "What does he know?" Ricky's mom was frantic. Her red-rimmed eyes looked wild. She came at me, grabbed my arms, and shook me much harder than my mom ever had, and pleaded, "Kyle, what do you know?" "I saw her go into his house, into old Greg's house." Those words set off a series of actions. It was like when Captain Kirk gave a command and everyone on the starship Enterprise jumped to. The big cop turned and spoke into his radio with grave tones. The crackly responses were quick and final. "We've got 2 guys over there now." He turned to leave, and his partner, the smaller cop, said the only kind thing I'd heard that night. You did good, kid, before he went out our screen door to join his partner. Ricky's parents glared at me, and even then, even as a little kid, I felt their hatred and resentment. Ricky's mom stood to leave, but before she did, she looked down at me and said, "Why'd you wait all this time to say something? She could be dead by now." When they left, my mom seemed too preoccupied to speak. She sat by the phone and took up smoking again, all while I trembled in silence. It was a gamble to do what I did. I knew even then that dreams didn't reflect what was real. But when the police searched Mr. Gregory's house, it wouldn't take long to locate Ricky. They'd find her in a crudely dug basement bunker. What they'd find would baffle everyone but me and maybe Ricky. But I don't know, since we never spoke again. In the bunker, old Greg has set up his old dental chair and had trays filled with surgical tools lined up, clean, gleaming, and at the ready for surgery. Ricky was duct taped to the chair, bound and gagged. Her dress had been cut at the abdomen to expose her belly. Of the 10 stitches old Greg had intended, 6 had been completed. 6 futile stitches in an otherwise healthy abdomen. Apparently, when he'd come out to watch the filming, old Greg had seen Ricky in her blood-soaked dress, and something had clicked in the old guy. In his deluded mind, Ricky became his dying daughter, and this time he wasn't going to let her die. When they cuffed old Greg, they said he'd cried like a child while repeating that, "The boy is bad." I shivered, recalling how he believed me to be his son. The whole time I'd been standing in his house, Ricky had been down in the dark bunker, tied up with useless stitches, pulling her skin tightly over a non-existent stab wound, while the only thing in old Greg's unstable mind was how to protect her from me. Although Ricky would undoubtedly be scarred for life, she recovered. Like I said, we'd never speak again. Sure, I wanted to talk to her. Sure, I wanted to ask why she hadn't told anyone about my dream, because had she, her parents wouldn't have blamed me for waiting so long to disclose what I knew. But then I figured Ricky had been through enough, so I respected her need to pretend I didn't exist. Years later, when I finally watched Halloween, it struck me as even more bizarre that its storyline was so similar to the events in old Greg's life. How much the story of a kid who stabbed his older sister matched the horror of old Greg's real-life circumstances. As I sat watching the movie as an adult, I would recall the last Halloween I'd spent with Ricky. Each time the camera panned the eerie Victorian looming on the tree-lined street, each time Jamie Lee Curtis pealed out a scream, I'd know that somewhere behind all the cameras stood 2 innocent kids whose young lives would be altered forever. It waits for me. I like to might call myself an amateur outdoorsman. I've been to places on foot that most people can only see in pictures. It's beautiful. It can also be terrifying. I've been lost with food and water for only a few days, trapped by a flash flood, attacked by bears more than once, miles from civilization and cell range, with a broken leg, and most recently, chased by something I didn't know could exist. In the late spring of 2013, I was exploring a new to me, region of forest in the Pacific Northwest during a break from work. My job allows me to periodically have a few weeks off throughout the year, remote to work and work at night if need be. It's one of the joys of being a consultant. I was planning on spending about a week in the woods and scouting some new hiking trails, climbs, and possibly even some fishing. I'm always open to new things, and I do my best to treat nature with the respect that it deserves. But what I saw didn't belong to nature or man. The day before my trip, I flew into the nearest town. The airport was about the size of a super Walmart, so several connections were involved. I went to a local supply store, a small mom-and-pop operation, for some last-minute provisions, as I couldn't fly with all of my supplies. While I was paying the cashier, they'd asked to see my ID for my card. I gladly supplied it, and she asked what brought me to her small town. I described my plans for the week and explained that I was a big hiking buff. We talked for a few minutes. If you know me, you know I'll talk to anyone. And eventually she mentioned the ghost town. Curious, I asked her what had happened, and she replied that it was really a mystery. The town sprang up in the 1840s as a result of a small local gold rush, and it was abandoned as the gold quickly dried up, seemingly within a few years. By the time the Civil War hit, the town was empty. By the time World War I hit, the town itself was overtaken by the surrounding forest. She joked that I could get lost there too, and we laughed about it a little, but I decided that I would keep an eye out for it. I love finding buildings lost to time in the woods. I found a cabin in south central Canada from the late 1790s that ended up belonging to a prominent Frenchman who became involved in the Revolutionary War and built his home in Canada after the war ended. I located an ammunition shed from the Civil War in the heart of the Appalachians that had been hiding nearly in plain sight for well over 100 years. And I found numerous old buildings that are too old and run down to properly identify. I wanted to have a map of some sort that showed the old town, so I went to the county records and pulled up some old zoning maps from the early 1900s that showed some poorly sketched locations for the ghost town. It was named Muddy Creek, after the stream in which most of the gold was located. The larger deposit lie upstream, hence the town's abandonment. The maps that I found were somewhat helpful, except for the fact that they all showed a different boundary for the actual town. The best map I could find was the oldest map in the bunch. It was dated 1899, was a copy of a copy, and had a large black X painted over where the town was. It still showed the boundary and even had a few buildings sketched in, so I took a quick picture with my phone. The week was incredible to start. I left town and headed on foot into a section of woods that neighbored a national park. If you're looking for virgin, or mostly so, areas to explore, the regions bordering national parks are fantastic. People tend to stay to the tourist attraction parts of the forest and leave the rest untouched, except for a few stragglers like myself, who tend to be low impact that you'll never know they were there. I had mapped my route out ahead of time and was looking at hiking 7 to 10 miles a day. Some days would be slightly further depending on terrain, but I've found at that pace I can really enjoy the hike and still get to see everything. Muddy Creek, the creek, was one of the first landmarks I encountered. I had to cross it less than 2 miles in one day. It did indeed live up to its name. As far as I could tell, it hadn't rained in over 2 weeks, and yet the water was brown with sediment. The stream itself wasn't very deep, where I crossed less than 4 feet, but it was high enough to thoroughly soak me, and I just barely managed to keep my pack above the water. I'd come prepared. Everything that needed to be in watertight bags was, but it struck me just how frigid the water was. It was nearly June, and the water felt nearly as cold as glacier melt-off. The next several days were beautiful. I saw bear, deer, wolves, and the largest elk I've seen in my life. I'd marked several spots with my GPS so that I could return at a later date and have a good campsite. I had pictures aplenty, and I was having one of the best vacations I've ever had. I was in the area of Muddy Creek, the town, but I'd yet to see anything that indicated there may be buildings or old structures nearby. I had 2 days left before I needed to be back, and I decided to cut a few miles off the end of my hike and search for the town for part of the following day. I set up camp in a somewhat cramped clearing and decided against starting a fire. The area was fairly dry. I woke to something rummaging around my tent after midnight. If you've encountered bears or other animals in the wild, you may have your own way of dealing with them, but I've found that when a bear is outside my tent, the best thing for me to do is get my mace and watch it. I try to keep cool. I've yet to have one actually try to break through the tent, and I keep my food in airtight containers to prevent them from smelling. As best I can, this isn't always 100% effective. I could hear something grunting and moving near the side of my tent, and I didn't want to move lest I alert it to my presence and alarm it. After a few minutes I heard a distinct snort, and then 2 loud thuds. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but then I could hear the thing stalk off heavily into the woods. After a few minutes, I managed to convince myself it was gone and go back to sleep. What seemed like a few minutes later, I was thrust into consciousness, but what I assumed was an incredible commotion outside my tent. I wasn't terribly wrong. It was pouring rain. The rain was coming down in buckets, and as waterproof as my tent is, it was starting to find weak points and was beginning to encroach on my gear. I quickly packed my gear inside, donned a poncho, and tried to wait it out. There wasn't much rain in the forecast for another week, so I wasn't totally prepared for a complete washout. The rain slowed from a torrential downpour to a steady, much more tolerable rain after about half an hour. I emerged and quickly packed my tent after getting as much water out of it as I could. I noticed that there were odd tracks around my tent. I was expecting bear, and these looked more like deer or elk. I noticed that one of my tent stakes had been chewed beyond use when it snapped like a twig while retrieving it. This seemed odd, but didn't send up any red flags. The rain had slowed, but was still steady at this point. I was just about ready to alter my course and head back closer to civilization when I realized I'd made an error. Muddy Creek, the creek, was now Muddy Torrent, the flash flood. The water was every bit of 2 feet higher and moving much quicker, carrying with it all manner of debris from upstream. I was quite trapped by the now raging river and had few options to get across. I had maps showing crossings 15 miles south of my current location and made a mental note to head there as a last resort, but I decided to continue on my planned route for 2 reasons. I told people that specific route before I left, so if they came to look for me, they'd come here first, and I was still curious about Muddy Creek, the town. I headed away from the flooded creek and towards where I suspected I'd find a town. The trees seemed doubly thick in this area, and everything was covered in a thick green moss. It didn't appear as though this place had seen any human interference in a very long time. I began to get excited. I was fairly certain that I'd found the ghost town. Finally, I had recognized the pattern along the rough path that I was walking. It appeared to have once been a high-traffic area years ago. The trees in this area were somewhat smaller and thinner than the surrounding giants, and the path was still ever so slightly visible. I couldn't see far due to the rain, but at that point I saw what I thought was a person standing 50 feet away in the drizzle. This puzzled me, but they appeared to be shining a bright light at me, almost as if they had a white aura surrounding them. I stopped and shouted, "Hello!" at them, but they didn't seem to move. There was an incredibly loud clap of thunder and an explosive flash of lightning, and suddenly I was on all fours. Lightning had hit a large tree not 20 feet from where I lay crouched on the ground. The tree was now ablaze, though the rain threatened the fire and quickly extinguished the blaze. I moved away from the tree as quickly as I could and looked up for the person. This time there was nothing. If they had been there, they'd move away quickly. The rain began to fall harder. I briefly searched for the shadow I'd seen earlier, but came up empty-handed. I continued to look for old buildings, any sort of ancient wooden structure, or a better defined path, but could find nothing. After a few hours, I was beginning to think that I'd been led on a wild goose chase, until I noticed a particularly odd-looking tree. It was very wide. It also looked very old. The other trees on site looked ancient, to say the least, but this particular tree looked as if it fathered the rest of them. It was then that I realized that this tree had grown around something, as if it was an existing tree, and it grafted itself onto an adjacent object. I began to investigate deeper. I dug a little with my shovel and hacked a few branches down. Eventually I realized that this tree had grown completely around an old cabin. It was astonishing. The tree must have been right beside the cabin, and for one reason or another the owner hadn't taken it down. The tree was large to begin with, but had apparently spawned a shoot that broke through the cabin and back down into the earth multiple times. The small building was just barely distinguishable through the myriad of branches and limbs. It was astonishing and intriguing. I began to notice more large trees, behemoths among giants. There had to be close to 3 dozen of these enormous trees growing around old dwellings. As I attempted to take a picture of one, I noticed my phone acting odd. Then suddenly it went black. Perplexed, I tried to turn it back on and got nothing. I had a waterproof case on it, but for some reason it refused to work properly. I thought perhaps that the watertight case had given or yielded during my haste to exit my campsite, but decided that checking it in the pouring rain wouldn't do any good. After a few incredible minutes, I again was thrown to my knees by a massive lightning strike, this time on one of the ancient trees. The fire was quickly extinguished by the steady rain, but my attention was drawn to one spot on the tree. There was a break in the branches, and I could see that there was a sizable cavern inside, at least large enough to fit a person. I decided I'd check my phone in there. I wasn't looking for cell reception, as that was impossible to come by out here, but I at least wanted to get the camera function back. I figured that lightning wouldn't strike twice in the same place, right? Once inside, I found it to be huge. The cabin had mostly eroded and decayed away with time. Only the old tree remained, with a cavern large enough to accommodate several people inside. The tree itself appeared to be a large, healthy maple tree. I'm not an arborist, so don't hold me to that one. And the interior was actually quite dry. I was able to briefly grab one of my dry towels and examine my phone. To my dismay, it was quite waterlogged. All the shots I'd taken over the past 5 days were on that camera. The trees, the creek, everything. Disappointed, I dried my phone as best I could and found the reason for the leak. My charging jack had popped open. I shut everything and put my phone in my pack, hoping that maybe it'd dry out once I got back and that I could save the photos. I waited a few minutes inside the tree and decided to eat while I had a dry place to do so. The ground was relatively hard, and I figured I'd be safe from any sudden flooding here as well. I had some dried beef and a trail mix for lunch, so I munched away on that while trying not to dwell on my ruined phone too much. Thunder shook the tree, and I dropped to the ground out of instinct. My knee came into contact with something hard. When I stood back up and brushed myself off, I also kicked the ground a little to see what I'd hit. I expected to see a root or something. To my amazement, I found a hinge, an old hinge. It was a fairly well-crafted hinge, and as I could tell, it was ancient, but it didn't have as much rust as I would expect for something 170 years old. I was guessing. My first thought was that maybe it was more recent and someone installed it after they found the town, but since the town hadn't been located on any maps in nearly a century, I figured this was unlikely. I kicked away more of the debris on the ground and realized I was standing on an old, heavy wooden door. Something was scrawled on it. That part, I could tell, was much more recent. It read, "Do not enter, avoid at all costs, leave while you can. William, 59. I could tell that something was written before the 59, in place of, but I couldn't tell what. It just looked like a gibberish and someone had tried to write over it. I realized that there was a large ring on the door. I've seen people vandalize national parks before, and I'll be honest, I was quite sure that some kid in 1959 had come along and tried to write a spooky note for anyone who followed on the neat hidden door in the tree. I grabbed the handle and tried to pull. The door was massive. It was incredibly heavy, and I didn't feel any give on my first 2 attempts. On the 3rd try, the door budged about an inch, and I managed to convince myself to try again. After much coaxing, I pried the door open with my shovel and was able to use it as a lever to open it the entire way. It braced delicately against the inside wall of the tree, just barely tilted enough to not slam shut on its own. There were steps that led down to a cement cellar. I could tell it was incredibly old as the air smelled stale and the masonry screamed pre-Civil War American frontier, i.e., anything they could make that would weather the elements. There were scribbles on the wall. Where it appeared those before me had vandalized the walls, but I couldn't make any of them out. They were covered in a thick layer of moss. At the far end of the room was another door. As I reached for it, I could hear something behind me. I quickly whirled around and scanned the area with my flashlight. Suddenly I could hear something. Stop. It feasts on curiosity, the whisper said calmly. It waits inside. Stop. It waits forever. The trees protect us. They protect you. I figured, great, I've lost my mind. I was certain. I sat down for a moment to try to gather myself. I certainly heard that voice. I looked around for a heckler. I figured someone on the surface was messing with me, but there was no one. I was quite alone in my little rainy forest. I reached for the old door handle and saw another inscription in the wood. This one appeared older than the first. It read, "Do not enter. Leave now. Frederick, 78." I could read all of this one clearly and figured again that someone had cruelly written on the door following the example set prior. I pulled the door and the hinges groaned as the metal slid for the first time in years. I entered into another room. This one appeared to be dirt. It didn't have any sort of masonry walls like the previous area. I couldn't make out any distinguishing features. I finally deduced this had to be an old storm shelter. I'd seen them in houses prior, unfinished basement or subterranean level with several doors to keep the bad storms out. Then I heard the whisper again. This time it was more urgent. "Please stop. It's still inside. We put them here for a reason." I got dizzy. I felt vertigo and reached for a wall to steady myself. Instead, I found myself falling forward as the wall had given way under my touch. A small opening about 3 feet in diameter opened in front of me. I could see another door, this one much smaller and older looking than the first two. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up as parts of my brain asked if the warning messages were real after all. I quickly dismissed this as I was probably the first person here since 1978. What could still be here? I reached to the door and again found a message inscribed in the wood. It was covered in thick moss, but I was able to scrape most of that off with my knife. It read, "Trapped inside. Do not open. Leave. George, 01. I wasn't sure if it was an elaborate ruse, but I was incredibly curious and I needed to know what was inside, so I grabbed the door handle and was about to pull when I heard the whisper once more. "I warned you. Leave. It wants you to stay." Now, I was creeped out. I quickly yanked the door open to take a quick look around with my flashlight and get the hell out of Dodge. As soon as I did, there was a loud screaming, wailing noise from the other side. It was continuous and caused me to fall to my knees in pain. It was like standing next to a 747 on takeoff. I finally managed to lean in and look. The walls appeared to be dirt, but everything was moving. I couldn't tell if I was experiencing vertigo again or if the walls were alive. I leaned my weight into the door and slammed it shut, abruptly cutting off the screaming sound. I sat in silence for several seconds before I gathered my senses and made for the door. Then I heard the whisper yet again. "You did this." I ran back into the first dirt room and noticed that the room looked different. One of the walls was cloaked in dark that appeared to just be dirt before. As I looked closer, the dark suddenly moved and whirled around the room. It turned into a dark figure standing directly behind me, and in a voice I can only describe as unholy said, "Thank you." I was terrified. I wanted to leave, but to do so, I'd have to turn in the exact direction of whatever was behind me to leave. I stood frozen for several minutes until I heard some familiar heavy footsteps trot away from me and towards the surface. Eventually I turned and saw that the thing had gone, leaving in its wake the tracks I'd seen by my tent earlier. Had it tricked me into opening the door? Was that just an illusion outside of my tent? Or were there more of these things in the woods? I went back into the room with the masonry walls and shut the heavy door behind me. I looked at the writings and tried to distinguish between mold and writing. I could make out numerous pentagrams, but vandals love to use that symbol when adorning walls with a new inscription, and the others seemed vague. Leave before, stop, it lures. I was seeing these inscriptions but not comprehending them. Was it vandalism? Or were there these warnings written on the walls? I left that room and made my way back into the hollowed-out tree trunk. I grabbed the door to shut it and found it curiously warm. The ambient temperature was much lower, almost as if someone had been holding onto the handle prior to me touching it. I lifted the massive door and finally pulled it free enough to let gravity take hold and slam it shut. When it did, the moss was dislodged somewhat, and I could read the first inscription in full. "Do not enter. Avoid at all costs. Leave while you can. William, 1859. If it was correct, that meant that this was right before the town really fell off the map. Maybe it wasn't meant to be found. I sat in the tree trunk for a few minutes contemplating what that meant when I was startled by my phone ringing. I guess it didn't die after all, but the fact that I had reception surprised me the most. I quickly pulled it out of my pack and answered it without examining the number. The voice on the other side sounded condemning and terrifying, and familiar. "It's yours to deal with now. It comes for you first." Startled, I dropped my phone and turned to leave, only to be confronted by a faceless mass of black with two sunken excuses for eyes blocking the door. I fell backwards and landed on my phone. I grabbed it and closed my eyes and ran forward. I don't know if I went through it or if it moved or what exactly happened, but I was outside in the pouring rain, standing in the center of the town, grown over by trees. I knew which direction I'd come from and bolted that way. You can only run so far in pouring rain with gear on your back before you reach your limit. I'm in good shape, but after a few miles I was exhausted and realized that I'd need to stop for the night. It was getting dark, and if I tried to hike at night I'd probably kill myself before making a mile. That night I was plagued with nightmares. I kept hearing things as I slept, and I swear every now and then a face would push itself up against the tent wall and vanish just as I fully woke up. The ground was particularly bumpy where I'd put down, and it felt almost as if things were reaching for me through the ground. The rain continued through the entire night. Finally, I could see light beginning to emerge from the horizon. I took down the camp as quickly as I could manage and was off again as soon as dawn had arrived. I decided to document my route. I wasn't going to be retracing it anytime soon, or ever. But maybe someone else would want to find a town. Maybe I was doing it to try to beat up my own fear over what happened. But I took pictures with my phone again, showing the route, any distinguishing landmarks, position of trees, relative to the sun, and any other important features I could think of. I made great time back into town. Nearly running the trails can do that for you, and arrived one day early. I was planning on staying out in the forest for an additional day until I stumbled upon the town. I told no one of what I'd found at first. I wanted to get the pictures onto my computer. Back at my hotel room, I went to my truck to get my laptop and upload the pictures. While it was doing so, I took a quick shower and ate some fruit. When I got out, the upload was complete, and I could view my pictures in high definition. The first few shots seemed perfectly normal, but as soon as I crossed Muddy Creek, I noticed a white border began to appear around all of my photos. I thought that maybe I'd gotten water in the camera then. This puzzled me as it hadn't failed until much later, but I continued through the photos. Once I got to the point where I assumed my camera was broken, the white border was thick and I could see a distinct white figure off in the distance on each of the last 7 photos. To my surprise, the phone had taken a picture when I dropped it before running from the tree. I could see what appeared to be a black shadow hanging in front of the opening to exit the tree. There was a thick black border around this one, and I could see a small bit of white, almost as if it were fleeing. The remainder of the pictures were bordered in black. I couldn't tell if my camera was breaking or if the water was damaging the picture files or what, until I came to the very last one. It was right as I left the woods and headed to civilization. I'd taken a self-shot by holding the camera out in front of me and shooting myself, and the path I just walked. Behind me was a tall black creature with no distinguishable features except eyes that were such a dark red they nearly blended in with the rest of the figure. Then I heard a whisper, a different one this time. "I'm still here." Jumping forward, I accidentally pulled my computer to the floor. There was nothing behind me. I rebooted my computer and found the data file with the photos on it was corrupt. It was no longer on my phone or the computer. I shivered for a moment and decided to book an early flight home. I left within the hour, paying a few $100 extra for an earlier flight. I don't see it much anymore. It's been a few months now. But at night, if I just turn out the light and roll over at the same time, I'll see it standing at the foot of the bed. And if I don't turn the light back on or turn the TV on, I'll hear it. Hear it whisper to remind me that it hasn't left, that it's waiting for me. I should have listened.